Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mental Health Advocacy Series. We're back with another great conversation this week. The focus of this series is mental health in the Black community. With this series, it's our desire to share information with the community on topics such as understanding what mental health is, myths and stigmas about mental health, generational trauma, therapy, and other resources and barriers to help and much more. Today, we will be covering the topic of generational trauma, and we are joined by some amazing people. My name is Tamika Daniel, and I'm the Behavioral Health Community Organizer with Greater Richmond SCAN. And I would like to toss it to my lovely co-worker, Amanda Lynch, so she can introduce herself and this evening's guest.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Litch, and I am a trauma informed training and prevention specialist at Greater Richmond SCAN. I'm very, very excited to be here to moderate this evening tonight. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Ron Begat, and then you can pass the mic over to Shep. And so you guys can go ahead and introduce yourselves, your name, title, and anything else that you'd like to share before we jump into the questions.
Okay, I'm Dr. Ron Bagat, and I'm manager for school culture and climate strategy at Richmond Public Schools. I'm also a community activist. Um, I've done various types of training in trauma healing, like community-based trauma healing, strategies for trauma awareness and resilience, emotional emancipation circles, and urban trauma. And I'm also exploring healing-centered engagement, just a variety of different modalities that address trauma in general, and then specifically racialized trauma. Also, I'm a restorative justice practitioner, certified in restorative justice, mindfulness, and artfulness. And I'm going to pass it over to Olufemi Shepsu.
All right, thank you, brother. Thank you, Miss Daniel, for having us on your program. My name is Olufemi Baraka Shepsu. I'm a native of Richmond, Virginia, and went through RPS. Started Southampton Elementary School on the South Side, and went to Henderson and Thompson for middle school, and finished up at Marshall Walker high school during the complex era, and then I went on to Virginia Union, got my undergraduate degree in history, poli sci, and I got my master's in social work at VCU. Been in RPS, Richmond Public Schools, since 1994, and I'm currently the school social worker at MLK Middle School, the mighty MLK Middle School. And my work, like Rom, is really focused in on racialized trauma, and really dedicating my life to the freedom and sovereignty of Black people, and specifically looking at enslavement, and what that did, to the Black mind, what that did to the Black family, the Black community. And now we have the science of epigenetics, which talks about the traumas and how the what happened on the plantation, on the slave ships, in the dungeons of West Africa has impacted our genes, which affects our psychology, which drives our physiological responses, and then from there we'll talk more about that during this session. I'm involved on a national level with the National Association of Black Social Workers. I'm the co-chair of the Pan African Affairs Committee. I am a sage on the African Centered Academy. I'm a member of NCOBRA on the Health Commission. And I'm also a shrine worker or a priest in the Akan tradition coming out of Ghana, West Africa. So these are things that I'm involved in. So just again, happy to be here.
Thank you both for joining us. And Mr. Shepsu, that leads right into our first question. Can you guys just talk a little bit about what generational trauma and epigenetics is, and how that impacts the descendants of enslaved Black Americans?
All right. Well, let's hop right into it. The first thing I want to deal with before we get into the definition is that the healing sciences that we are have been taught in the academies, from social work, psychology, the rehab sciences, psychiatry, all come from a Western perspective, European and Western perspective, and they use the DSM-5 as a manual to diagnose and treat mental illnesses. People having mental challenges. However, when we're looking at people of African descent here in the Americas, we were torn and stripped away from our motherland by the British, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and the other European nations that participated in the triangular trade of enslavement. And in that process of being torn away from our families, our men and women being raped, sodomized, burned, boiled, eviscerated, lynchings, all those terrible things that have taken place in the dungeons of West Africa, on the slave ships and on the plantations here. It impacted our DNA, or we call that the science of epigenetics. And that's a study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Unlike genetic changes, the epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence. But however, the genetic markers are there that impact your psychology. So now we're looking at flight or fight responses, ancestral hypertension, diabetes, bipolar disorders, anxiety, depression, and even the addictions are all driven by our body's epigenetics. And being under a system of 402 years of white supremacy and domination that has kind of changed our psychology. So you've taken African people and stripped them of their culture, introduced them to a European worldview, a European cultural imperialism is what we call it. And so now, not only have you changed the epigenetic functionings of Black people of African descent, now the whole psychological framework has now been changed. And there has not really been any formalized discussion or treatment modality to facilitate people of African descent healing these wounds. And lastly, before I turn over to Ram, the Western modalities of psychology look at the individual and their circumstance. It doesn't really take into the history, the biology, or the environment. So now you have a manual that drives the diagnoses that's blaming the victims, pathologizing the behaviors of Black people that have been under constant attack from the west coast of Africa on the slave ships, being harassed, being tormented, being raped, being sodomized by our oppressors to where we are now. So does that kind of make sense? And I gave the abbreviated version. So we have this model, and the epigenetics now proves, not that we needed to prove our case, because we know what we went through, but epigenetics now gives a science to how trauma has impacted people of African descent.
Absolutely. So what I think I hear you saying is like the field of epigenetics really examines the ways that all of these atrocious colonial experiences have turned things on or off within our genetic code, almost like a light switch where things can be turned on and things can also be turned off. And Dr.
Exactly. And just to add on to that, Dr. Cheryl Grills, she was the former president of ABSI, the Association of Black Psychologists, very powerful sister. She's doing some wonderful work, the Community Healing Network, on in most of the emancipation circles. But she was explaining this in Richmond 2019, that when our genetic codes or those markers that have been kind of altered by enslavement, the markers actually, when you see certain images or whatever that reminds you of the trauma, your mind is moving in milliseconds. So your behaviors are being driven chemically in the blink of an eye. So you don't even really realize how fast your mind is working. And that psychological piece is very powerful. So when we're looking at the psychology of people of African descent here in America, we're essentially looking at the Black mind under oppression. Under oppression. We look at our psychology. And all of our minds have been tainted by it because we all come from enslaved ancestors. And then we all are all dealing with the micro and macro aggressions of white supremacy every day.
Dr. Bagat?
Yeah, so I would build on what Olufemi said by looking at generational trauma as defined in this way, that it's a collective experience of an overwhelming biological, psychological, and spiritual effect, that because it's collective and it's overwhelming and it's repetitive and it's ongoing, that it starts to create cultural changes and biological changes within a historical framework. So it's historical, it's something that happened over time. And it's almost like if you have certain types of seeds and you plant them in a particular type of soil, and that soil is rich, right? And it has all of the nutrients and all of the like essential components to nurture the growth of the plants that have been, the seeds that have been planted, right? So then you get certain strains of a particular plant, let's say, that is resistant and resilient. And if you continue to cultivate that soil over generations and over generations and over generations and over generations, then the seeds from those plants can be planted in rich soil and produce the same resilient and resistant plants. Now, if you take those seeds and you put them in a soil that's deficient, hostile, toxic, full of harmful chemicals, full of lack of sun, lack of water, the chemical makeup, the biological makeup of those plants are going to start to change and reflect the deficiencies in the soil, right? However, I would also add that because of the generational health that those resistant and resilient seeds have developed over time, that there's still going to be resiliency in some of the plants. Some of the plants are going to suffer, perish, or develop defects. No, I wouldn't really say defects, but adapt to the deficiencies. I just want to keep in mind, though, that even though there's this generational trauma, there's also this generational resilience, because prior to the Ma'afa, or the Holocaust, that African people endured and continue to experience the after effect or the aftermath, the the genetic makeup, the spiritual makeup, the cultural makeup has not been destroyed. It's inherent in the cellular makeup of African people based on centuries and millennium of being cultivated and a rich soil. Now we see ourselves over, I mean, we could go back further than the triangular slave trade to look at the evolution of oppression and collective trauma. But if we focus on the triangular slave trade, we can say about 500, like a 500-year time period. Our resiliency compared to that 500 years is 5 times, 10 times stronger than that. So, like Shepsu was saying, what we're seeing now, and we don't talk about it enough in the proper context, is the aftermath, the effects of 200 years of slavery, 100 years of coming out of slavery and dealing with Jim Crow, post Reconstruction, fighting for civil rights. Just like being in a cultural setting that is toxic, that is hostile, that is against the thriving of this particular group of people, right? So that is passed on from generation to generation. Like you could even look at the Jewish Holocaust, which was over a shorter duration, and descendants of individuals or the group, because this we're talking about collective when we're talking about generational. There are certain behaviors, certain ways of doing things that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are exhibit. And then the last point is the perpetrator is also traumatized. Sometimes it's called participatory induced trauma. So engaging in, experiencing, witnessing, participating in the type of brutality that Olufemi described, which happened on those plantations and which happened on the slave ships, which happened in the dungeons, which happens in the schools, which happened in communities, which happened in business environments, which happens in this Western culture, traumatizes the perpetrator as well. So I would say there's a need to really diagnose the white psychosis that is part and parcel of this collective trauma that is a result of probably one of the most inhumane institutions in human history.
And I think too, in examining that white psychosis and even looking at things like tree equity, the removal of green space from Black neighborhoods, medical experiments, and all of those things, and just the way that they've shown up in Black and Brown communities, at least since we've been on this land, is really important. And so I appreciate you bringing up that experience as well. A few weeks ago, I was giving an intro to trauma and resilience workshop, and there was someone there whose father was a descendant of the Holocaust. And not until we entered into some discussion did she realize the way that lack of safety and control influenced his parenting, which is now influencing her parenting. And so, with epigenetics, it doesn't just show up in a biological way, but it also does show up in that environmental way, in the way that we interact as a community. Which brings me to the next question. Could you all just talk a little bit more intentionally about how these things do show up in our systems and also in a community?
I'll just jump in first, Shep, and then pass it over to you. Like if we're talking about symptoms, um, addictions, um, inferiority complex, the disparities in the educational system, health inequities, wealth gap, opportunity gap. A lot of times when we look at these categories which represent people, the perspective that's often used is to blame the victim. Like blame black people for being in poverty, when that's a system that was created to produce the conditions that create this inequity in health. And when you think about the plantation and the skilled labor that was stolen from the continent, like it wasn't like people were brought here who did not have certain skills, right? Or and this is documented in the slave ledgers that Khalil was a blacksmith, or you know what I mean? Like we our ancestors covered all of these different areas of expertise that made the plantation thrive, and also set the set the stage for the same type of exploitation. Like even when you think about inventions that have enhanced the lifestyle of within American society, so many of those inventions were produced by Africans, and then the inventions were stolen, and the patents were granted to to the Europeans or to the whites who were in control. So on an individual level, we see all different types of symptoms and conditions in the family, the breakdown of the family. And that brings up another point, that it's ongoing, because even after, like when I think about my grandfather's generation, that was more like in that Jim Crow era, family was of the utmost importance to them. That goes back to the idea of the resiliency. So it's been an onslaught. That slave plantation mentality has constantly changed forms to keep us oppressed. And then what we see happening in our schools is it's a derivative of massive resistance, like here in Virginia. What we see in our schools is a direct result of a system that was against integration, and that enforced inferior education. Yeah, I like to focus on the resistance and the resilience part, because even though we've undergone these horrendous and tremendous obstacles, and obstacles is really not the right word for it, there's no way to stop. There's no way to suppress. There's no way to eliminate or eradicate, even with the boldest lies. There's no way to eradicate Black excellence. It's always going to emerge. It's always going to find a way, either over, under, around, or through the oppression, you know? Like the propaganda that's set up is part of, you know, keeping a lot of us in that mindset of, you know, that slave mentality.
Yeah, well, I guess, really, how it shows up, just to add, what Ram is saying, is that we don't, it's right there in front of us, but our context is through white psychology. So when we're looking at our behaviors, and we've been trained in these Western modalities, which most of us are, if we got our MSW and our MDs, everything else, then again, we pathologize ourselves based off of their definitions in the DSM-5. So how it shows up is that all of our behaviors here in the United States, as I said earlier, the anxieties, the depressions, the bipolar disorders, the addictions, the schizophrenias, the poor health outcomes, and we can look at the numbers with high child mortality rates, cancer, diabetes, hypertension. All of these particular physical ailments affect us at a very disproportionate rate.
No doubt.
So what the context is that people of African descent, mental health and our poor physical outcomes are directly a result of white supremacy and domination. So regardless of whether you're a vegetarian or whatever else your diet may be, you can go jog 50 miles a day. But if you're under this system of the micro and macro aggressions, and as we just said, the power of the epigenetics, then your mental and physical health has been somewhat compromised.
Yeah.
It has been compromised.
Oh, no doubt.
So the question we have to ask ourselves as people of African descent, are we functioning at our best? Are we thinking like how we should think? And that question would be no, because we're speaking someone else's language. Okay. We're dealing with someone else's religion. Okay. Our manhood and womanhood has been compromised on the plantations. And let's talk about the whole jail system, prison system. That's a whole another conversation. But our ancestors knew nothing of jail or being locked up or bound until they came in contact with the Europeans. So jail was a foreign construct to our ancestors. Okay. And homicidal behavior, psychopathological, and we can look at the European history and we can look at their behaviors going back to Greek and Rome and in the Middle Ages, and we can look at their behaviors and see a lot of what happened around the world when the British and the French and the Dutch went around the world. They took their cultural reality with them of attack, destroy, pillage, and dominate. Okay, and so if our minds have been impacted, and we are not, because really what the answer of the question is culture. Once your culture has been compromised, then you're not mentally or physically healthy, and you're not in symbiosis or balance, and then your thinking or your thought process is delusional. All right. So really in America, we function and we have survived. We can hold down a job, or we can do whatever else that we can do. But look at our people. I mean, we're in a broken state. All right. And we can look at the whole scenario, and then we have the whole concept of the internalized racial oppression. So then we internalize that European worldview and ideology, and then we attack each other. And we can look at what happened on this past Sunday. And it wasn't as simple as we think it is. Some of the dialogues that I've heard, but that's a black man attacking another black man. All right, and we see that going on all around the country, of just how our minds have been set that we attack each other because of us not being in our right minds under this system. And the internalized racial oppression is now you take that toxicity on, and then now the closest person for you to attack is another black man, or your wife, okay, or your husband, or your child, okay. So that's all of the plantation politics still playing out here in modernity. So again, all of our behaviors, including our physiological health, has been impacted, tremendously impacted and compromised. And we call that in the Black psychology or the African psychology framework, we call that cultural misorientation. an overrepresentation or internalizing of the European worldview, and not being who we are as African people. And again, once your culture has been compromised, then you cannot be healthy. That's like, I mean, I will use an extreme scenario. That's like teaching a dog how to be a cat, or vice versa. The cat is now barking. Okay.
Yeah.
It
So
can,
let
it
me
can,
let
go
me
ahead.
jump in. So when we look at the disparities, like social determinants of health, when we look at life expectancy, maternal infant mortality, um, the most common diseases, the most common forms of, the most common causes of death, it disproportionately affects um, people of African descent. And the other side of that also is that there's something inherently powerful in the cultural roots of people of African descent, because we are constantly evolving from or emerging from and finding ways to reinstitute, right? To reinstitute um, the greatness of our cultures. So, just for example, like Harlem Renaissance or the African spiritual renaissance in America. So regardless, and then how African traditions and African cultures are infused into European cultures, and in a sense dominate. It dominates. Like if we look at food, for example, in certain countries, right, where African people have influenced the cuisine. So we're constantly um, resisting oppression. Like there were revolts, numerous revolts on plantations. It was never acquiescing or accepting the domination of our oppressors. Never. And we still do it now. Even if we look at our hair, even if we look at the way we dress, even if we look at all of the different um, inventive, creative things that come out of our community that have impact in the world. So while we're still under this oppressive system, we continue to resist against that system. And then the last point too is with those health disparities and social determinants of health, right? There's always like this analysis of those things as here's a disparity between black and white, their white counterparts in terms of cancer rates or in terms of homicide rates or whatever. And there's never, maybe not never, but hardly ever any discussion about so what is or what are the root causes of these disparities. It stops at the disparities. It stops at, well, the graduation rates for black students compared to white students, disproportional. The suspension rates, disproportionate. It stops there and it doesn't go into, so what's the root cause? And then that's when we get into denial that there's no such thing as racism. There's no such thing as institutional racism. There's no such thing as systemic racism. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Martin Luther King said, "Don't judge by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character." It's still laced and wrapped in white lies and white denial and white psychosis, and there's I guess it's that fear of acknowledging, that acknowledgement of I don't even know. I mean, of the mega Holocaust of the Ma'afa.
And it's a denial of the fact that many of these systems are working just the way that they were designed to,
Oh yeah,
which is to disenfranchise Black and Brown communities. And so, you first have to acknowledge that, you know, um, before we can move forward. And so, just leading into our next question, in what ways can we learn more and understand more about how generational trauma, epigenetics, all of these things impact our day-to-day lives and impact our mental health.
Yeah, I think first of all, when we have these discussions, there are a lot of folks don't have a real clue of really understanding the basic terminologies of racism, white supremacy, or domination, and they don't have a historical framework. So if you don't have the historical framework of how this country was founded and the systems that took place to create it, and what took place to not just us but also to the indigenous people of this in the country, then nothing really makes any sense to you. Studying race, studying culture is a science. It's a science, and it takes many hours of study, and also reevaluating your own life and having a lens of looking at the world through a racialized lens. I view the world as a black man, you know, unapologetically, and looking at not just myself, but now connecting to your ancestors. That's the other piece. You got to connect to your ancestors on a spiritual level, not just by calling their names, but connecting to their spirits and what they were going through and how they survived. And I know we talked about a lot of heavy subject matter here, but also how they thrived. You know, the nation building efforts that Ron was saying. So we got to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of our experience here, and then view it from a cultural lens.
Mm.
A cultural lens, because the culture is going to be our savior here in the United States and throughout the diaspora. And we look at what was going on in the 60s, the underlying piece of the 50s and 60s was Black culture.
Yeah.
It was African culture, was cultural nationalism. That was the glue that really held this thing together. So that's got to be the framework of understanding, of fully understanding who we are, what has happened to us, and how we move forward. And it's understanding that our ancestors are constantly with us. And lastly, once we get past this blockage of enslavement, this 402-year blockage of enslavement, then we will connect or reconnect, or there will be a reawakening of our ancestral DNA and a symbiotic relationship with our ancestors. And then now we're connecting with the Ashanti Empire, the Yoruba, the Fon, the Manding, the Malinke, the Mandinka, all right, the Dinka, the Shona, the Zulu. And then once we connect with the vast culture, or reconnect with the vast culture of West Africa, then we go back to the source. We go back into ancient Kemet, back into Nubia, back into Meroe, of a vast civilization that was 30,000 years in the making. Because African people, we are the first people on the planet. We civilized the planet. We charted the stars. We created the mathematical sciences. The Greeks and the Romans learned from our ancestors. The ancient Kemetans, when they civilized the Greeks, they called them children. That's how old our people are. So once we get past this, and as we said earlier, those genetic markers from trauma can be reversed. Mm-hmm. And once we do a concerted healing effort and bring our people out of our collective amnesia all throughout the diaspora, and we finally heal and heal our ancestors, then we will be able to reconnect to the pyramid builders, charting the Sirius stars without a telescope, and all those miraculous things that our ancestors did for thousands of years. Because we're not the children of the enslaved, we're the children of the pyramid builders. That's who we are.
Yeah. I would go back to looking at it along a time continuum, like Shepsu was talking about. It's like this particular period that we're talking about of enslavement is just a small fragment of our historical traditions, our historical lineage, right? And Also, we have these these touchstones or these flashpoints, even here in America, where there were mass movements of reawakening, like the Garvey movement. Garvey, come on now, this is in the 20s, right? Organizing masses of folks to repatriate to Africa.
Martin Delaney,
Martin Delaney.
How to Be Wales.
Yes. So it's like that memory, that it's that memory of we didn't forget who we are. It's this constant pressure. It's this constant assault on our biology, our psychology, and our spirituality, and our being to remain in this inferior position, right? So we have to heal collectively, and we have examples, historical examples of where we have, like even the civil rights movement, right? Where it's showing that we did not forget who we are and where we came from. When we're constantly bombarded with these lies, the lies of white supremacy, constantly bombarded with these stereotypes, right? And there's so much evidence to the contrary. Like even the stereotypes of the happy slave or the ignorant slave who just picked cotton. We were scientists. We were blacksmiths. We were
George Washington.
tradesmen. We were midwives. We ran the plantation. We built the universities here just like we did in Africa. We because of the free labor, the brutal free labor, this country amassed this wealth that you see reflected in all of the downtowns and the metropolitan areas all around this country. That came directly from having a labor force for 200 years plus that you did not pay. You never paid. So imagine that. You had a force, a labor force of the most skilled labor force working without pay for centuries, building your wealth. And then you want to whitewash that. You want to change that because you don't want to lose power. You don't want to lose control. You don't want to admit your crimes. You don't want to acknowledge the harm that was caused.
Just say, get over it.
Get over it. And then even now, you want to spin a web of confusion with like CRT. And these things are triggering for African people. It creates sometimes a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, like we're never going to get off this. We're never going to get out of this quicksand of oppression. And at the same time, everywhere in the world where there's been colonization, white domination, there's been resistance. Everywhere. So it's what side you're going to choose. Are we going to heal? I mean, I think those of us that are woke, and I have no problem with saying woke, where some people look at that negatively. What's the opposite of being woke? It's being asleep. It's being asleep. So the people who are looking at, oh, that's woke or that's CRT, that's an indicator of just where you're coming from. And now when you hear white people saying, Martin Luther King said that we shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, that's just another indicator of perpetuating the same lie because you are taking it out of context. You were totally against him when all I would have to say, so where was that sentiment on the Pettus Bridge? So we definitely need to be woke. We definitely need to understand the impact of trauma and how we can overcome it, and how we can help each other. And I think the simplest way is through emotional emancipation circles, collectively getting together, building resilience with each other, We're a communal people. And we can go on and on about that, but like getting together and creating self-help groups where the space is safe and liberated, and we're supporting each other, and we have guidelines that support each other, and we have to do it. We have to do it just like Marcus Garvey did it. We have to do it just like the Harlem Renaissance. We have to do it just like Steve Biko and Black Consciousness. And we're going to do it. We have been doing it, and we're going to continue to do it. We just need to amp it up.
And I think too, we have to be okay with being uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
There's just no growth happens without some level of discomfort. And so,
Mm-hmm.
as we enter into those listening and learning spaces, um, to walk further towards healing, we also have to understand that some of it's going to be hard and some of it's going to be uncomfortable. A lot of these things you're not going to get in the average classroom because they're not being taught. I don't believe that you can enslave the human spirit. And so where maybe my great great grandmother was enslaved, she certainly wasn't a slave, right? She was a midwife, she was a mother, she was a community leader,
Right.
she was lots of things, even if it was framed on the Palmer plantation in Powhatan. And so,
Yeah.
I think that that's the first step that a lot of times people will. Our natural disposition is not to be uncomfortable, right? We resist feeling out of place or feeling like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to engage in this type of inner work. But we can't heal without first doing that and acknowledging that. And so that just goes into the next question. What are some things that we can do individually to start breaking the cycle of that generational trauma? We've talked quite a bit about collective and what that looks like, but on an individual level, what are some things that I or Tamika might be able to do going forward, and those watching, to break some of this generational trauma now that we first have like a working foundational understanding of what it is, how it happened, what's the next step?
I think I look at my personal voyage and looking at some of my other comrades around the country that are actively engaged in healing ancestor wounds, is that you got to now uh, find out about your ancestors. Find out what were their challenges. Where did they come from? Sounds like your people were down in Powhatan, and I have relatives. My great grandfather Beverly Taylor moved to Granite, which was the Forest Hill Chipman corridor. It was called Stratford Hills, but it was called Granite. That was an all black neighborhood. He moved there to work in the granite quarry along the James River. So you got to find out about who they were, what were they doing, how did they survive, how did they thrive. You got to feed them. You got to talk to them constantly. You got to go to the courthouse to look at the records. You got to go up on Ancestry.com if you have a subscription and find out about them. So now that you're living through them, you're seeing the world through their eyes. You're experiencing what they experienced, and so now we heal the ancestors, and they in turn healed us. As I said, it's a symbiotic relationship. Then the other piece I would like to say is that now you got to start to deal more with traditional African culture. Start taking a look at the drumming, dance, all those things that we as African people do, and those ritualistic arts that just who we are, that's innate with us. That's a natural healing. And then also, which we don't do anymore, we don't do like how we used to, the fun aspect of breaking bread with your family. The card games, the playing the bones, having the fish fries, having those types of communal activities that are scheduled with your immediate family and your extended family in whatever region, to try to get that balance going on again, where we're talking, we are worshiping together, we're eating together, we're doing all those things that we used to do back in the day that's now, because everybody's so busy now, but we got to get back to that. And then the last thing that we got to, I guess, take a look at is that now once we establish those family bonds, and we strengthen our family, then now we can take on the nation building aspects. Because our ancestors were nation builders, the homestead movements, the Black College movement, the buildings on those campuses were built by the students. Having those skills, the brick masonry, the carpentry, the drywall, the electricians, the plumbers, all of those bread and butter skills that will allow us to be able to build Black wealth, to be able to transform our communities in our own image and our own likeness. And then that starts to not only formalize psychological and physiological healing, but now we have a nation building effort. We have now the economical base to build our own communities, fund our own enterprises, and do for ourselves like we heard Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the UNIA, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany. These were nation builders. Magdalena Walker, John Mitchell. They were nation builders. And once we reinvigorate that spirit in our people, and it's going to happen again, we're going to see another Black Renaissance, then we can formally move out of this mental conditioning, this physical conditioning that we have, and reverse the damage that's been done by the epigenetic intergenerational harm.
I would just add, we have to love ourselves. We have to know ourselves. We have to take those lessons that have been passed down, and if they haven't been passed down, open our minds to study the culture, study the truth about what really happened to us and how it's still affecting us. If we need help, therapy, then go to a therapist that most likely would have been trained in the Western modalities, but they done extra training in African modalities or African-centered modalities. Have a daily practice, and strive to be consistent with the practice, because sometimes things block us from, our own habits, our own, and the culture too. So our habits are formed by our actions, which are influenced by our culture. I would say individually, explore your identity, explore our identity, like find the most accurate test to determine your African ancestry. And I mean, none of the tests are going to be 1,000% accurate, but find the most accurate. And I had a intern from Korea who made this comment when I shared the results from my African ancestry DNA test. She was like, "That's soul healing. That is soul healing for a black person in America to be able to say, wow, my grandmother's lineage is from Sierra Leone, the Temne people, versus my people are from North Carolina, and it's good to know our family tree. My people are from North Carolina. Where they come from? Oh, they came from Louisiana. Where they come from? And there's millions of us that can't go there's millions of us that can't say we're from Nigeria or we're from Congo. Like, we don't know. And the reason why it's important is because it was intentionally erased. It was intentionally severed to know where you came from. A lot of our people will say, I'm not an African. That shows the depth of the menticide of the disease. That an Irish person will say, oh yeah, my people are from Ireland, or my people are from France. But we can't go back that far, and we feel comfortable or uncomfortable thinking about going that far because of what's happened to us. It's just like Herschel Walker, like, come on, bruh, talking about CTR, CTR, and we not black, we not white, we Americans. It's like, bruh, we ain't trying to hear that because it's not true, first of all. You know what I'm saying? Like, we just talked about the disparities based on race. So individually, we have to find that truth. And then I think individually, we have to connect with each other so that it's collective, because that's the trauma was produced collectively. The, the trauma on the plantation was collective, it was not individual. The Ma'afa was collective, it was not individual. Our healing is going to be collective. So as individuals, we can't be separated anyway because of Ubuntu and Sawubona. Like, there's no separation. What happens to me is happening to you. If I'm not free, like this brother describes, Sawubona, if I'm not free, how can you be free? So I think individually it's the awareness that we're part of a collective consciousness. So our practice should be about making ourselves the best that we can so that the collective can be. And that, like Shepsu was saying, that includes ancestral. It doesn't just stop in the physical plane. It's an energy. It's
And,
an energy.
and, and and let me just briefly add to that. When we're talking about the whole Western psychology, that there's no real acknowledgement of spirit. African people, whether you're here in Richmond or you're in Ecuador, Chile, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil, wherever the slave ship went, we are fundamentally, our behaviors are fundamentally the same. We speak Portuguese, Spanish, or French. And I've been to Ghana 3 times throughout the years. And you see a common African self-consciousness with our people.
Yeah.
We are a very spiritual people. And we call that African self-consciousness. So how, and not just the spirit piece, but how we talk. We're very expressive. I mean, you can see a brother, he can have his head fully wrapped and have a winter coat on, but you can tell how he's walking. That's soul brother number 1 going down the street.
Mm-hmm.
That's soul sister number 1, just based off how we move and sway. So that's what makes us who we are. So that's the African spirit, our ancestor spirit, and we see people in our family say, "Boy, you look just like Uncle George. You got that little P-shaped head. You talk like him. You walk like him, or whatever." I mean, don't y'all see when you go to your family reunions?
Mm-hmm.
You see they're calling you out. Man, you look just like such and such and such, and you act like them too. So that's the spirit that reside. We are an ancestral people, and when we're severed from our ancestors, then we can't be whole. We can't be whole. And we're not talking about religious. That's a whole other conversation. We are a spiritual, ancestral people. And our ancestors have got to be in our homes. They've got to be in our community. They got to be in every setting where we are. And when that spirit is with us, then we will become whole again and better understand who we are as African people. I mean, it's powerful. It's powerful. And the African worldview acknowledges the primacy of spirit, and how that is the number 1 priority for us as the ancestors.
Thank you. And I know we're, just getting ready to wrap up. Just touching on what you said about the ancestral piece, that was something that for me, I had to learn as an adult, right? Like the difference between spirituality and religion. Um, and even with my own children, thinking about how affirmations will help to rewire the brain. I truly believe that calling upon ancestors also does that same thing, and that there's
Oh yeah.
a lot of power in, all of my girls are named after a great grandmother or great
Mhm.
aunt, or, and calling upon those persons during those hard times and reminding them that you are the daughter of, you are the granddaughter of, just as a part of our daily conversations and affirmations. And so I appreciate that. Um, but just, in closing, how do we heal? Just a final thought on how do we heal, and what does this healing look like? Um, and you can speak to your own experience just very briefly if you'd like. I know for me, again, it was really learning about where I came from, and not that we started on the Palmer plantation, right? But where were we before that? And so that was a large part of my own personal healing um, in terms of racial trauma and seeking truth.
I would say, for me, my journey, started really as a child. Really looking back, some of the things that was going on in my family just led me to this. It was one event led to another, but the formal process started my freshman year at Virginia Union when I came into the state of racial consciousness, a very beginning state of it, and then having some very powerful professors, Dr. Norma Good, Miss Florence Bay, A. Peter Bailey, one of Brother Malcolm's acolytes, was my Jegna there. Um, then leaving Union, then getting into the African spiritual systems and African world history, and now a practitioner of an African cultural spiritual system, which is the Akan tradition out of Ghana, West Africa. Those things kind of have helped heal me. And then I'm also the co-creator of the Maafake Buka Ancestor Commemoration here in Richmond. And now, with our society, we do rituals and gatherings to heal the ancestors that came in to the James River. And now that process there has now not only allowed me to connect to my ancestors, but the multitude of ancestors that came in along the banks of the James, and also then at Fort Monroe and Norfolk and West Point, these other places here in Virginia, and actively heal them. And now they in turn heal me.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing process, and like um, it's definitely tuning into your ancestors, tuning into the spirit, tuning into the supreme, um, sending out requests to the universe that um, you want that healing, and that you're going to surrender and be receptive to it, and then also realizing that a lot of what we're talking about is going to be refuted, and not being deterred by that, because a lot of the visionary things that we're saying will be comes become uh, commercialized in a few years. Just like the idea of drum circles, or things that have, or restorative justice, things that have become popularized are things that were just a natural part of living. Like the drum circle was never called the drum circle until, however recently that became a label for it. And knowing that it's not a linear process, that sometimes there's going to be steps forward and steps back. Um, Being empathetic towards other people and what they're going through, and maybe what you have caused because of the conditions that have affected you, and how it has impacted other people, family members, um, friends, and just nurturing. And even though it might seem like it's just going to take it might not never happen. Just the act of of being engaged in the healing process and just building up the energy around that healing process. Um, like people will feel it, and people might feel it more from you than you feel it from yourself, right? Because you might know you probably know yourself better than other people know you. Um, and giving yourself some love, like giving yourself some love, not being like so hard on yourself that you don't see the light that's within you. And I think another way too is connecting with the next generations and just like seeing their little bodies and just interacting with them and planting seeds with them. Yeah, like we're only here for a limited period of time, and then the older we get, the the, the more we see that horizon. So it's what am I here for? What can I accomplish while I'm here? And finding the people that are of like minds and get on with them. Like get on with them because for me at least, I've always felt like it's something you really can't do by yourself.
So for me, just doing things like this, being a part of things like this, I was that person that Mr. Shepsu and Mr. Pagai spoke of not seeing an ending in sight, being so used to all of the things that plague, my relatives, my grandmothers, my great grandmothers, my granddad, my dad, and all of those things, and just thinking that that's how it was gonna be. But me finally acknowledging and seeing other things, seeing more of my Black people in higher positions and doing so many amazing things, it just made me want to do better, learn more. Because before this conversation, I was one of those people who only scratch the surface level of generational trauma. So usually I'm commenting and speaking a lot, but in certain conversations where I have a lot to learn, I just sit back and observe and soak in as much knowledge as possible. So I just want to thank the three of you so much because you guys have taught me so much in this last past hour and some change. And I know this is it's going to be received well. I feel amazing in the inside. So thank you so much.
We want to thank you for bringing us together and organizing and being persistent.
Yes. Um, so is there any parting words before I close us out?
I just want to thank you all. It's always great to be in the space with family. And so it's really great to see you both.
Yeah, and lastly, just want to close out with Ram, stated earlier that, we are an ancient people. We are the progenitors of world civilization. And what happened back in 1619, a few years before that, is just a small blink, a blip on the timeline. And we are going to return back to who we are. We're going to have a larger Black Renaissance. It's going to shake up the world,
Hmm.
and our ancestors are on us, and we're going to go back to doing those miraculous things that our ancestors did. So it's just a matter of time, and then 500 years from now, this will just be a lesson that we're talking about.
I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we've come to the end of our time today. Thank you again, Amanda. Thank you again, Mr. Bagai and Mr. Shepsu, for being a part of this conversation today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation informative and encouraging. And we will be back next week for the next conversation in the Mental Health Advocacy Series. Take care, and we look forward to staying connected with you.